Hey everyone, Phreak here. Want to record a video to talk about essentially game theory behind building decks in League of Legends. And I wanted to do another time capsule thing because I'm still pretty new to high elo card game sphere. I want to again put my thoughts out there and just see if I'm even right without doing a ton of extra research. So a lot of my background is in economics and game theory and stuff, and that's actually a lens through which I look at most things. Actually, that's like the perspective I take to tackle problems. And to me, deck selection in a card game is very much a game theory problem, and it is essentially solvable. And so, since I believe that this is fairly easy to solve, or at least fairly easy to describe the solution, my second time capsule, as we're just over a week into the beta season of Legends of Runeterra, is here is my believed fully congealed theory on deck selection, specifically when laddering in a card game like Legends of Runeterra. So to me, there's basically three-ish things that matter. Okay, so one is there is an independent variable, which is something that you can't choose. It's just true about the world at this time. And that variable is the decks that are out there that people are playing. And this is both which decks are played and how often they are played. Those are the two things that matter as independent variables. I'm going to run into this deck this much, and that deck that much, and this other deck this other amount of time. So on and so forth, down to the smallest percentage points. That is immutable and unchangeable about the world. It, in and of itself, will change as people develop other decks and come up with other ideas and talk amongst one another. That variable will change, but it is independent of your choices. So that's step number one. That is true. That is a simple fact that there is an independent set of decks out there. The second thing, and the third thing, they're kind of conjoined, is you can bring whatever deck you want into that world, right? So if you're playing on the North American ladder, 13% of all decks are Elise Darius Spiders, let's say, right? And it's like, okay, well, knowing that, what deck do I want to bring, knowing that 13% of all decks are Elise Darius Spiders? So it's not only what deck do I bring, but how do I tune that deck? One of the things I talked about in my first time capsule was kind of along these lines, saying that, if Ionia Deny becomes a problem, just play burst spells. And in fact, I had a deck list that I've laddered with for a couple of days, and I've streamed with it. That was Demacia, Ionia, Elusive Aggro, that specifically didn't run any non-burst spells. So that if I played a medium to long game, my opponent would eventually have 1 to 2 to maybe 3 completely dead draws where they drew Deny and it literally couldn't do anything. It was a completely dead card in the matchup. And that is me basically doing my dependent variable thing. The deck that I bring is based on what's out there. I choose to run a list without Will of Ionia or Deny. That means that I can't be denied, which means my opponent draws dead cards. Thus, my matchup should be elevated, because they'll draw a dead card and I'll draw Radiant Strike. Radiant Strike has value, Deny has none. Now this has it has its own problems. Like if they draw Will of Ionia, I can't stop it. Things move on down the line, but the point still stands that you can make choices that are that depend on the independent variable. Okay, so essentially what I am saying is that the second and third factor is you can choose what deck you bring and you can choose how to tune your deck. Okay, this is not the big thing so far. Of course you choose what deck you bring. Of course you choose what cards to put in your deck. Okay, so here is the major thrust about this point, is that the optimal deck to bring into the ladder is simply a multiplication problem. It says, tell me every deck I expect to run into on my server at my MMR, right? So tell me what server I'm on and what decks are played on that server at my rating. So tell me my independent variable, and then find me the dependent variable that I can plug into this function that spits out the highest win rate total, the highest expected number of wins in 100 games. right? That is ultimately what you're solving. That is the sort of theorem that I am suggesting is immutably true about laddering in a card game. Is the optimal deck is simply a math problem of tell me the independent variable and then find the dependent variable that multiplies against it and comes out with the highest expected win count. That is the only thing that ultimately matters. Asterisk, game time kind of matters. If you can win 12 games in an hour versus winning 11 games in half an hour, yeah, you probably take the 11 and half an hour, even if it's 11 out of 100 versus 12 out of 100, right? You'll take that different win rate difference. Plus 11 versus plus 12 is what I mean, not 11 wins. You'd obviously drop if that was the case. Going plus 12 in an hour versus going plus 11 in half an hour, plus 11 half an hour is better, even though the win rate is lower. So that asterisk is game time, but we're not talking about that right now because that has its own weird knock-on effects that is sort of implicit with the system. Okay, so again, the theorem is there's simply a game theory math problem of pick the right deck that finds. It basically does this, right? So I'll do the sort of the first corollary, which is you're essentially trying to maximize your win rate against popular decks, and you don't care as much about your win rate against unpopular decks. That's what it comes down to. And so I threw up some math for fun. Said, okay, let's pick an example. All right, so there's the first thing, right? This is the deck we're playing, okay? We are playing a deck that has a bunch of different win rates. It's 85% against Noxus Shadow Isle Spiders, and it's 15% against Freljord Shadow Isle's Control. And it's, middling against Discard Aggro, and it's middling against Ash Frostbite, and it's pretty bad against Fior, and it's pretty good against Elusive Aggro, right? This is the deck that I am running. And I'm running this deck in a world where exactly 1/8 of the ladder is split equally perfectly across 8 different decks. Well, if my deck centers on a 50% win rate, right, and I run across all expected matchups equally, then my 50% expected win rate deck comes out to, right here, 50% expected win rate across 100 games, right? Here's my independent variable. It's the matchup rate times all the decks that exist. Here is the deck that I am running, right? This is my win rate against each of these decks. And then as a result, here's where we are. And this is the theorem. This is necessary. You need all these bits of information. And sufficient. This tells you all you need to know to prove out what the optimal deck is, right? In the very first meta, where everything is exactly identical, my very first deck is a 50-50 deck. All right, then we say, well, okay, what if the meta changes? What if the meta goes aggro, right? And we see all of these decks 20% of the time, and these slower decks only 5% of the time, right? I'm still running into these 8 decks, only across 100 games, but my win rate is skewed to be good against aggro. I have an anti-aggro deck, and it's an aggro-heavy meta. My overall win rate across any given deck averages 50%, but the meta is aggro-heavy, so I'm actually a 62% win rate deck to the latter. And this is what you are trying to do. Identify the meta, play the deck that is good against the meta. This is, in actionable terms, what you're actively trying to accomplish when queuing up a deck on the ladder. And if the meta changes again, and we're suddenly aggro light, we're control heavy, I have the same deck with the same 50% win rate, but because we are anti-aggro and not anti-control, we have a 38% win rate on ladder. And that's obviously really bad. We're going to decay. We didn't get worse at the game. We didn't change any cards in our deck. Our matchups changed. The independent variable changed. And if we want to do well, we have to adapt with it. We need to update our deck. We need to update our deck to be anti-control. And the extra point, because we never talked about this variable mattering, right? We don't actually care about the sum total or average win rate across all decks equally because that is not part of the theorem. We don't care about this part of the theorem. That's not relevant to us actually at all, right? Theoretically, this is a well-tuned deck, right? It is fine. It's 50% against other well-tuned decks on average. That's reasonable. We're on par with other deck building skill, whatever. This should be fine. But in some metagames, it's not. In some metagames, the things we are against are simply good against our deck on accident. They're not even necessarily trying to counter us. We just simply happen to be a bad fit for the metagame. So, for example, one of the things that have happened very early in LOR in the first week is there is a lot of Demacia Ionia elusive and Freljord Ionia elusive, immediately followed by Noxus Shadow Owl Spiders, probably immediately followed by a lot of discard Jinx Draven aggro. And if your deck had these kinds of win rates, you were pretty good because you were in this metagame with a really high pick rate on these 4 decks, and your win rate was really high, and hey, it felt good, right? Worth noting, a lot of Ionia in a lot of these decks. And so running, low reliance on deny counters makes you pretty happy. That was what the meta call that I made. It worked pretty well for me. I climbed with that deck. But if you go into the control-heavy metagame, if you go into a control-heavy set of decks, suddenly the deck we run matters. We have to change the deck we run. Suddenly we care about slower effects. Suddenly we care about being able to withstand things like Ruination. Suddenly we care about denying Vengeance or stopping Rasa from coming down or whatever. And we can have an objectively weaker deck. We can have a deck that averages out to a sub 50% win rate, but it's okay because we're not playing against random decks. We're playing against the meta. And the meta is control heavy. And we pick up 57 wins out of 100 instead of 38 wins out of 100 with an, air quotes, objectively weaker deck, right? This bottom deck has objectively lower total power, lower total power than the previous deck, but it's a meta call. The meta is control heavy, and so the deck we run is better, and we're going to end up winning. And this is where it gets into something that's also interesting that I definitely noticed when I was watching, for example, competitive Hearthstone, is that different servers would have different metagames, right? And so, North American server decks versus European server decks versus Chinese server decks would all be quite different. NA and EU had a little bit of intermingling, but Chinese decks were often quite different. Because their metagame was very, very different. There's a lot less sort of cross-cultural pollination. And so the decks you ran into were different. So the decks you had to run were different. And this can mean you can be in a state where if people are are not researching each other and you come to a big international tournament and you're just going to run the best decks that you know how to run, you might have the European server where it's really control heavy. And so it's a bunch of control decks that are tuned to be good against control decks, right? It's control decks that are good against control decks. And over on NA, you've got aggro decks that are good against aggro decks. Then they fight each other, and they both have bad matchups into each other, which then goes to 50-50, and it makes it interesting. But you're like, well, I'm running an aggro deck with no Will of Ionia and no Deny because I need to just outrace all the other Ionia aggro. And over on the other side, you've got this control deck where you're running 3x Heimerdinger, 3x, Pursuit of Perfection, which are just unplayable in the aggro matchup. And well, we're going to go figure out what happens here because the one deck can't answer Heimer. The other deck can't barely play Heimer, but if it gets played, you just win the game automatically because they can't stop him. What happens? Who knows? And so that's the important thing is hey, the summary, the conclusion, the end answer is this is my theory on optimal deck building and deck running for a ladder environment where you're playing against the field and you think you have a decent glimpse into what the field is running. Who's on my server? What MMR am I at? What decks are being played there? With that information, I want to maximize my win rate against the popular decks, and I don't really care about my win rate against the unpopular decks. And I run the deck that maximizes this equation, and the only thing I ultimately care about is the very bottom figure here. I only have these three, really 2 variables and 1 product. How often am I against what deck? How good is my matchup against those decks? You map those out, and you care about the final sum. That's my theory on optimal deck building. I hope that maybe helps you. If you have any thoughts, please let me know. I'll see you next time.